Hey there, this is Terry Wheat from onceuponawheat.com, our travel blog. We went to a place a few years ago that was really unique. It is somewhere I bet you've never been, don't know anyone who's ever been unless you're Pennsylvanians, and probably never even thought to go. It's kind of a creepy place, kind of quirky. It is from a dark piece of American history. It's pretty legendary. If you're under 40, you have probably only heard of the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant from the X-Men Wolverine movie. And if you are over 40, you probably remember the crisis of 1979, where 2 million people were exposed to trace amounts of radiation contamination. And it is still to this day the worst nuclear power plant disaster to ever occur in the United States. And so it's pretty legendary. It's still talked about quite a bit in movies and books and TV shows. It's referenced in just about any conversation you have on nuclear power. So in 1979, it was kind of a unique era, kind of a perfect storm for this to occur in, to create a lot of fear, and the public might have been a little bit naive to what could happen. It had only been a little over 30 years before when we had the World War II atomic bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And so that was still really fresh in everyone's mind. The images of it, there were still survivors talking about it then, people who had lost loved ones. And so that was still in fairly recent news and memory. And then you had, in the 1970s, you had the energy crisis. Especially in 1979, there had been some oil embargoes over in the Middle East. It was very hard to get gas here, and so people would stand in very long lines for hours and hours trying to get a little bit of gas for their vehicles to get to work. The gas stations that hadn't sold out of it already would have very small limits on how much gas you could get, and that didn't go very far in the gas-guzzling, inefficient cars of the 70s. The prices went sky high. It was about $3.50 a gallon in today's dollars, and people were even concerned about if they would be able to heat their homes in the winter. And so you had the terrifying witness of the immense power of nuclear energy from the testing and the bombings of the 40s and 50s. But then you also had the U.S. wanting to turn it into something that could be used for good, something positive. We were in an energy crisis, and so people were hopeful about the potential of nuclear power. It was sold as the Great New Hope and something that could potentially fuel the entire world for thousands of years with very little fuel that you could like hold in the palm of your hand, I've heard before. And so you had both sides of that coin. You also need to remember that science and technology, it was moving very, very fast. It had been a little less than 10 years since we had put men on the moon at this time, and things were moving very fast. We didn't have the internet or YouTube, and I feel like the public was very trusting, but maybe they weren't fully knowledgeable or educated about all of the details to the science and technology that was going on, and so they were fairly trustful, I think, of that, and very hopeful. You also had the Cold War. This is the middle of the Cold War that had been going on for decades, and the Cold War is where we were locked in a very real, very scary threat, where Americans were fearful that the Soviet Union, today's Russia, that they would send nuclear bombs that would try to wipe the US out and potentially start wars that could end the entire world. The Soviet Union's people were told the same thing. They were very fearful of America doing that to them. And so it was a very tense time. As a kid, Bill and I had a lot of fear about that. I'm sure most other kids did, and I'm sure our parents did too, having little kids at the time. So as kids in school today, unfortunately, kids have to have drills for an active shooter in the building. And when we were kids, we had the duck and cover drills where we would have to practice during school for a nuclear attack should that happen while we were in school. And so it was pretty scary. We would see films of what would happen if people get radiation poisoning, and it was pretty terrifying. They sold fallout shelters, and some people bought those to put in their backyards. Hollywood made plenty of movies and TV shows regarding nuclear war and nuclear attack, and so it was a prevalent theme, and it was like a constant underlying tension and fear that was running under the surface. So 12 days before the 3 Mile Island accident happened at the nuclear power plant, you had the first movie that I'm aware of that specifically addressed what would happen if there were an accident at a nuclear power plant. And it was based on a fictional plant out in California. And there's a point in the movie where the nuclear engineer says to someone that if they had an accident, that it would render an area the size of Pennsylvania permanently uninhabitable. And then 12 days later, Pennsylvanians were going through a very kind of similar nuclear scare for a period of 5 terrifying days where they feared for their lives, feared for their children's lives, for their homes, for their entire state, and America held her breath and wait. So nuclear power, so you have uranium-235 in the core, in the nuclear core. You have it compressed in there. Uranium-235 is highly, highly radioactive, highly, highly unstable, but the nuclear fission process that goes on creates a lot of heat, and that heat they have to kind of aid the nuclear fission process, but also very much to try to control it. They continually put cooling water over that nuclear core so that it doesn't overheat and get out of control. So during that process of continually putting cooling water on it, it generates a lot of steam, and then that steam is pushed to a turbine that is used to attach to a generator that's used to produce electricity. And so the night of March 28th of 1979, the middle of the night, 4 in the morning, only 3 operators in the control room. The operators had been cleaning out a filter with an air compressor, and a little bit of water got into the system. And all of the computer systems and fail-safes and backups to backups, the system recognized that and it did not like it. And so it shut the cooling water down. And so now in the very hot, very radioactive nuclear core, it was not getting new cooling water, and the heat was not being taken out. And so the pressure, of course, started to build. The heat built up, and the steam, and the system recognized that the pressure was getting too high. It did the right thing, and it opened a relief valve. Well, that relief valve was supposed to open for 10 seconds to relieve the pressure, which would have been great, but it got stuck open, and it stayed open for 2.5 hours, but the operators had no idea that entire time. And so while that relief valve was stuck open, and all of that steam and water that had small amounts of radioactive contamination, while they were pouring out into the containment was set up to be able to handle small amounts of that, 10 seconds at a time. It was never designed to take over 60,000 gallons over a 2.5 hour period. And so the containment broke. The container in the containment building broke, and the radioactive or radiation contaminated steam and water poured out onto the ground of the containment building, and the sump pump sucked it up and moved it over to the auxiliary building. And the auxiliary building was never created, never thought that it would ever contain radiation contamination. It wasn't built for that. It was never intended or thought to happen. And so that was disastrous. But the operators were very slow to find out much of this. And so they didn't realize it at first. And so as the steam continued to expand and as the core continued to heat up, that steam and that water that poured out continued to be more highly contaminated with radiation. And so at a certain point, crisis number one happens, and as that auxiliary building fills with that, bits of it escape, but it takes them hours to realize it. They don't know it at first. And so while this is happening, then they're losing so much pressure that suddenly the reactor has too low of pressure. And the system recognizes that, and it does the right thing, and it turns on the emergency cooling water. And the emergency cooling water is going into the core, but then the operators misread the sensors. They're kind of poorly designed, and they think that the pressure is too low because the reactor is actually filling up with water and becoming too full to the point where it will be considered solid, completely full of water. And if you get too much pressure of the water building and continuing to come in, then it could rupture the reactor. If you rupture a nuclear reactor, that radiation, the radioactive uranium, is going to be unleashed into the community, and so that is a horrible thing. And so they turned off the emergency cooling water, which is the worst thing they could have done because the nuclear core was starving for cooling water. It was overheating, but they thought that they were avoiding a catastrophe. And so the two methods of it getting cooling water were turned off, and that core continued to overheat. The system recognized it, and it thrust in the control rods. That stopped any of the new nuclear fission process from going forward. But you still had all of that radioactive decay within the container that was still lingering from the initial process, and so it was still continuing to overheat. So it slowed down the process, but it didn't stop that train from going. And so it happens pretty quickly, and people are out in the public have no idea. It is not until 8:30 in the morning that they hear anything about it, and they hear a little blurb on the radio, just the locals, saying that there has been a little incident at 3 Mile Island. They have it under control pretty much. There's no danger to the public, no leaks, and people generally think it's no big deal. But by 8:30, by the time they even heard this, they've already went to school, they've already went to work. You could have some guy across the street from the nuclear power plant mowing his grass. You could have a stay-at-home mom out in the backyard with her toddlers on the swing set. People are going about their lives. And so at 10 in the morning, the operators realize that there is a huge amount of radiation in the containment building, so high, in fact, that it would be deadly to humans within seconds. But they still think they have it contained. By 11 a.m., they realize and detect a little bit of radiation contamination outside of containment on other areas of 3 Mile Island. But it is so small, and they think they still have the situation contained, that they don't think it's a threat yet to the public. And so the next day, on Thursday, they realize that the auxiliary building has had a bit of a leak to the atmosphere. And by that evening, Thursday evening, they realize that the pressure is so high from the steam, from the radiation contaminated gases, the radioactive gases, and that they need to purposely vent it into the atmosphere, which includes the surrounding communities. 3 Mile Island is this little river island in the middle of the Susquehanna River, and On this side of it, you have a road and you have houses and farm fields. At the end of the island, just past it, you have little Middletown, Pennsylvania. On the other side of the river, you have other communities. And so there are people living all around it, small towns. All of Wednesday and all of Thursday, the people went about their lives out and about, going to school and work, and had no idea that there was any radiation contamination. And it is not until Friday morning that they learned that there is a problem, a big problem, and they declare a state of emergency, and the Pennsylvania governor actually initiates an evacuation order, just a limited one for a 5-mile radius, just for pregnant women and very small children like toddlers. But people panic, of course, and 144,000 people flee. So you have people leaving their homes, leaving their doors open, leaving TVs on, people going to the banks and taking their money out. It is chaos. So this is Friday morning. You have Friday, things are getting so hot that decay in the core is exceeding temperatures of 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And so it is starting to melt the core, which is the absolute worst case scenario that can happen at a nuclear power plant. Sorry, you hear Wanda drinking her water. It is the worst case scenario that could happen at a nuclear power plant with a nuclear core, is that it would melt down. And the movie I talked about, the China syndrome, that came out less than 2 weeks before this, the China syndrome is a term that experts use. It's based on an exaggerated theory that if a nuclear core, the fuel, were to completely melt down, it would absolutely 100% eat through or burn through the 8 inches of steel surrounding the core. It would absolutely burn through the 4 feet of concrete surrounding the steel in the core, and it would burn straight into the earth. And the theory, the China syndrome theory, thank you, Wanda, is that it would burn all the way through the earth. It would be like radioactive magma that would be unstoppable, and that it would burn all the way through the earth, clear to the other side to China. And so it has never occurred. It would be a catastrophe like the world has never ever known, even to this day. You would set loose this uranium-235, and I talk about in the article I'm doing on this situation on our travel blog on 3 Mile Island. I talk about a little bit about what that would happen and why that would be so bad, but it would definitely be deadly for a number of people, and it would make an area for who knows how many miles permanently uninhabitable. And so you had that going on in the core, that it was melting down. In fact, it melted halfway down, and the operators, no one knew it. No one realized how bad it was. And so because those temperatures were exceeding 5,000 degrees, the sensors started to go haywire, and the operators were no longer even getting accurate readings from that. And so they were kind of thrown off before by some poorly designed sensors, but now they were flying a little bit blind with having sensors that were no longer accurate. And so the FDA contacted Friday night, in the middle of the night. The chemical manufacturers tried to get 250,000 doses of potassium iodide for the public should this contamination leak go wider and broader and higher levels, and that would be to give people a dose so it would saturate their body with non-radioactive iodine, so that when radioactive iodine could potentially be in the air, their body wouldn't absorb it, trying to get iodine. So it was a mess. It was chaos, and it was made worse by the fact that the communication of that era in general was very difficult. So you had not only the operators and the plant supervisors and the plant engineer had their things going on, and the plant engineer would hold press conferences, and then you had the state officials, the governor and lieutenant governor having their press conference, and then you had the federal agencies. You had the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the NRC, you had the FDA, the EPA, the Department of Energy. You had manufacturers who had made little pieces, the relief valve and the different parts, who were trying to get a hold of and talk to the plant supervisors, and you had experts in the field who were trying to communicate. And back then, we did not have cell phones, we didn't have texting, emailing, none of that. We had a landline, a phone with a cord, and if you were on a call, it would ring busy. If someone was trying to call you, it would ring busy. So as you can imagine, with all of those people involved, there were a lot of phone calls flying around. That phone rang busy most of the time. Things were escalating by the second, very chaotic environment. And so no one was getting the full information, fully accurate, and so they were delivering this piecework communications to the public, and sometimes it was inaccurate and misguided, and things were such a mess that the public felt like they were being deliberately lied to. So you had the crisis number 1 of the radiation contamination leak coming out the relief valve into the auxiliary building. You had crises number 2 with the core starting to melt down, and those created the conditions for crises number 3. And when the core was melting down, the zirconium that was encasing the uranium-235, it had started to melt. And when the zirconium started to melt, it had a chemical reaction with the steam and the water in the reactor, and it created hydrogen. And the hydrogen kept building, and it created a bubble. Now, the experts were really concerned about this because they knew that if it continued to build pressure, that eventually it would create an explosion. And you do not want a nuclear reactor full of uranium-235, highly radioactive, exploding. What the public knew about a hydrogen explosion is they knew that we had had these terrifying bombings and testing on atomic bombs in the late 40s and 50s, and then they came along with, they said, well, we've got the big daddy of the bombs, the hydrogen bomb, created with fusion, is literally 1,000 times more powerful than an atomic bomb. And so that's what the public knew about a hydrogen explosion. So it was terrifying for everyone, and the US President Jimmy Carter became very concerned. He had been concerned throughout this. He had officials there keeping him apprised of the situation, but he decided that he was going to go in and tour the plant. His officials recommended against it because they said, if we had a hydrogen explosion at this plant with the uranium being released, that would be a catastrophe for the people in all of Pennsylvania, and who knows how far, but if you go, we could also lose our president of our nation and the First Lady, Rosalind Carter. So it would be devastating to our country. And so he decided to go anyway. He had some experience with nuclear power. He had a decent understanding of it. Some people say that Jimmy Carter was a nuclear engineer. He was not, but he was commissioned as one of the first commanders of a nuclear-powered sub, and he did have several months of nuclear operator training, and that was a career path. He was going with the Navy for a while when he was younger. So in fact, he and his crew and some other people helped Canada when they had a partial meltdown problem with their reactor, and they were sent up there. They practiced outside unbolting and taking apart a sample core, and then they would suit them up and stick them down into a nuclear core, which would never ever be done today. You would not dip someone in there. Even in 1979, you would not put someone in a nuclear core that had thousands of times of radiation levels of what any human should ever be entering, but they did. They put him down there for 90 seconds, no more, and they let them unbolt and take apart whatever they could in that 90 seconds. And Jimmy Carter said that his urine was radioactive for 6 months as a result of that. He went there though because he wanted to calm the public's nerves, and it was very much needed, and it did really work to a great degree because people thought if the president and the first lady are going to go into this plant, maybe it's not as bad as we're thinking it is. And so it was very helpful. And by the time that they visited on Sunday, the plant, the experts with their calculations had realized that the reactor did not have, or that the hydrogen in the reactor did not have enough oxygen to create an explosion right now. And by the time that it would be a problem, they had days or weeks to think about that. And in that time, they could safely vent it. And so at that point, after 5 terrifying long days of crisis, it was over. But they didn't even tell people until a week. I think they were probably waiting to see if anything would happen next. And they didn't lift the evacuation order for nearly 2 weeks. Most of the people came back to their homes within 3 weeks, but some of the people never returned. And so after this incident, as you can understand, the nuclear power industry took a big hit in the public's perception. They lost their trust. There were a number of nuclear power plants that were in the process of being built, had put millions of dollars into them, and they were completely dropped after this. In fact, no new nuclear reactors or plants were approved for over 30 years after this. And so it took 14 years to clean up the bulk of this. 3 Mile Island actually had 2 reactors, and only one of them had the accident, so the other one continued to operate. But it took 14 years and $1 billion to clean that up, and parts of that are still so radioactive that they can't get the last bit of the cleanup until the year 2041, so that's when they'll conclude with that. The other reactor there worked for years before the second one that had the accident went into use, and it continued to operate for over 40 years without problem. And most of the operations in the world, in the US, operate with no problem. Some other countries like France do a really great job with their nuclear power strategies and processes. And this accident, of course, it changed regulations, it changed training, it changed emergency procedures within the government, it changed safety procedures, it changed the whole game. And so we have a friend named Jamie, and he's a great guy, and he's super smart, and he was a nuclear operator on a carrier, a nuclear powered carrier for the Navy, and he has talked about how much they have learned, how different the process is. They monitor over 2,000 sensors for a nuclear reactor, and they have to know what every single little thing means and what all it could potentially ever happen and affect and what that would do. They have to know every possible case scenario, because when 3 Mile Island was put in and was processed, it was sold to people as, you know, it could never happen. You know, that's just in the movies, and kind of like the Titanic when they said it's unsinkable. But after they saw things that could go wrong, then the industry is much safer. So the plant, when we went, it was in 2014, so the first reactor was still operating at the time, and we went to Middletown, Pennsylvania. That's the small town right at the end of the island where the people are from that live across the street from 3 Mile Island. And we went through the main town, and it's a very small, typical, simple American town. And as I went down that main street, you'll recognize parts of it from the news footage where the fire engine was going down the street and they were announcing over a bullhorn that there is a state of an emergency and to stay inside and keep your windows and doors shut. It sounds and looks very much like an apocalyptic movie. It's very kind of creepy. I thought of the people fleeing down that street in that town and going to the bank and taking out their money. I thought about how they walked around and lived and went to school in that town for 2 days before they realized that there was any radiation leak. And then we went down the road, and you will see through the break in the trees the very iconic tall cooling silos that start thinner and then widen out at the bottom, and they hold the cooling water for the reactor. And you will see those when we went. The first reactor on the right hand side, it was still operating, and so it still had a lot of steam going out, and it was kind of eerie because I thought, those people, saw that steam coming out for 2 days and they didn't realize that there was a radiation contamination in it. I thought this could be doing the very same thing this very moment and I would have no idea. So it was kind of eerie to see it operating. Then you will also see the bridge that goes over to the island. It has a sign, even though today it has been closed down to financial difficulties. They just did that last year in 2019, September. Same year of the 40th anniversary of the accident. They still have security, and so of course you can't go over there. As I said, there are parts inside that are still so high levels that it would be unsafe for humans. And so you can see the bridge. Jimmy Carter used that bridge, and it's in the news coverage. You can see of him driving over there. And as you go down the road, you'll see all the little houses on the left-hand side of the road. They are cute, little, simple, average, everyday American houses like you would see in any little town. And these people lived there and had to flee their homes, not knowing if they would ever be able to come back to them or get any of their belongings. A lot of them moved back and lived under the shadow of 3 Mile Island for decades more. I'm sure always wondering if that would ever occur again. And so it was a sobering experience to look at those. As you continue on the left side, the same side as the houses and the farm fields, you will also see their building that when we went in 2014 was their training facility. But back in 1979 during the accident, it was their visitor center and viewing station. And if you watch any of the news footage where the engineer from the plant gives any of his press releases, kind of contentious with reporters, all of that footage is done in front of this building. The building looks exactly the same. If you watch that footage, you'll recognize it. Out not far from there is the state landmark sign that gives a little paragraph about the 3 Mile Island disaster in case you're coming through town and don't know. And that is pretty much all there is to see and go and do. I was so thankful to be able to go there, though. It was worth it to me. It was really neat. It's close to a lot of other places. It's close to Hershey. It's not that far from Philadelphia or Gettysburg. It's an easy little side trip. And it was, I love walking across the footprints of history where very significant things have happened. And as I said, the 3 Mile Island disaster is legendary. It occurred in my childhood, and so those things kind of stick with you. So it was really interesting to be able to see. It was really creepy to be walking around out there with my kids thinking, if things were definitely headed down that direction, and if they had gone a little bit worse, this area that we're walking on where people are still living could have been very deadly, and this entire land could be permanently uninhabitable. And so it was certainly chilling to be there, and I'm so thankful that even though it was a terrifying incident, it wasn't the tragic one that it could have been. So I talk a lot more in my article about the safety of it. It's safe to go to today if you're wondering, but I talk more about that in my article, so you can look if you're wondering. So 7 years after the 3 Mile Island incident, we had the disaster of Chernobyl, which is the world's worst nuclear power plant disaster. And then in 2011, we had Fukushima. So in general, the systems worked. You had problems with operator error or poor system design or poor training or workplace culture or environment, but the system itself generally worked and did the right things. So 3 Mile Island was really creepy for anyone who lived through the Cold War era, because it was the start of our worst nightmare coming true right in front of us. And so 3 Mile Island is the United States' worst nuclear power plant disaster still to this day. And I pray that it remains the only one that you can visit. If you'd like to visit, I encourage you to. It was really interesting to be able to go and look around with the 360 view and see it and see how close the houses are, and just get a picture in your mind for not only us, but especially for our kids going to these historical event places where these events took place. Really makes history come alive, and it really makes it seem so much more real. And it's a really new place to go get a picture of and say you've been. Not many people at all can say that they have. So if you like the video, please give us a like and a subscribe. It helps our channel so much, and it helps you to be able to continue to see our videos and for us to continue to do those. We'd love to see you on our travel blog at onceuponawheat.com. Like I said, I'm going to have the article that goes with this that'll have some different pictures and some different information of our visit to the 3 Mile Island area. And so I'll have that, but I have a lot of other articles on different places. We go to some history places, but we do a lot of fun things too. We do a lot of unique things and find a lot of hidden gems that a lot of people don't necessarily know about. So sign up for the newsletter there so that you kind of see some things that are going on in our home life, so that you get our new post, and so that you kind of know things earlier than everyone else of what's going on with us. I send a newsletter out every week, so sign up for that on the travel blog, and then come follow us on social media. We'd love to have you. We're just about everywhere. We are on Facebook and Instagram and Pinterest and Twitter, as well as YouTube. So come follow us at all of them. We'd love to have you, and we'd love to interact with you. And thanks so much for joining us, and I'll talk to you soon.